I know the recruiting process can be pretty confusing, so I want to walk through it A to Z and show you how to get interest and scholarship offers from college coaches so that all the confusion sort of dissipates and you have a pretty clear idea of what you need to do in order to get your kid to a school that they love. Okay, so I put this little diagram here together, and what we're going to do is we're going to walk through each one of these pieces and how they work together, because you've probably heard of some of these pieces before, right? You've heard about email and you've heard about Twitter, you've heard about showcases and camps, but you're not really sure how they all work together, and it's critical that they do work together. Because if they're just one-off tactics and you're just doing these things because you heard that you're supposed to, then it's going to be really hard to generate interest and offers in college recruiting. So instead, I'm going to show you how they all come together to form one system, and that's going to get you much better results. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. In the beginning of the process, you have 0 schools interested, right? You have no interest. And the goal is that you want either scholarships or roster spots for your kid. And so we are trying to move from no interest to opportunities, okay? And so as we look at this diagram, we're gonna move from the top of it down. We're gonna look at this as if it's a funnel, okay? So in the beginning, you have 0 interest. No one knows that your kid exists. College coaches are out trying to find players for their team that can help them win championships. And you're like, listen, my kid can help you do that. My kid is really good. You should take a look at them. The problem is that college coaches don't know they exist. A lot of time in recruiting, parents think, well, my kid is just really good, so college coaches are gonna see them because of that. And that's just not true anymore. Like, there's so many good players, and there are so many players just in general. It's way too easy to go under the radar and completely overlooked, even if your kid is a really good player. So we have to put them on the map somehow. And so that initiates phase 1. Phase 1 is what I call interest generation. It's where you don't have any interest whatsoever. No coaches know you exist. And so you're trying to put your kid on the map. When it comes to interest generation, there's 4 ways that you can get on college coaches' radars. Those ways are email, Twitter, coach referrals, and recruiting events. Now, here's the thing about these 4 ways, okay? Most of the time, people focus on these 2, okay? So they focus on coach referrals and they focus on recruiting events. Now, with coach referrals, you can expect between 3 and 5 coaches to connect you with schools. Sorry, not 3 and 5 coaches, but your coach to connect you with 3 to 5 schools. Most people think, hey, my travel coach or my club coach is super connected. They're gonna go connect me with like 40 schools. They're not going to, right? They're not going to go make 40 or 50 calls on your behalf. They have too many players that they have to do that for. They're not going to do that for you. So they'll make 3 to 5, but they're not going to make like 40 or 50. So you are not going to get mass exposure from coach referrals, okay? So we'll talk about how to actually use referrals and what that looks like in a second. And then the second thing that a lot of people put focus on here is recruiting events, right? And with recruiting events, we're talking about tournaments, showcases, camps, anything like that. And so you can expect between 1 and 5 interested college coaches from these events. Now, if your kid is a top 10% player, that number is going to be way higher. But if your kid is not, then that number might be a big fat 0, right? Might be a big fat 0. So we're not trying to use these recruiting events for exposure. We're trying to use them for evaluation. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. And so we just determined that these 2 right here, coach referrals and recruiting events, are not going to give you mass exposure, right? They're not going to put you in front of a ton of college coaches and give you the possibility to get a lot of interest. They're probably not going to do that, right? And so we want to utilize all 4 of these yellow boxes here, okay? And so here's what this looks like. With email specifically, we want to send between 50 and 100, okay? Now, that might sound like a lot to you, but you have to understand that college coaches get a ton of these things. And this is cold email. They're not expecting to hear from you. So if you want responses to emails, you have to send it high volume. There's really no other way around that. So let's say you're going to email 50 to 100 schools, and that's going to put you in a pretty good position to start conversations with college coaches. Now, the other thing that you're going to do is you're going to utilize Twitter, because a lot of recruiting also happens on Twitter. And so the hope is that we can generate some interest with Twitter as well. And so now we have email rocking and rolling, we have Twitter rocking and rolling. And so these two are going to give us the potential for mass exposure. You don't even have to leave your house to get interest from college coaches using these two, right? So these are going to give us mass exposure, and we're going to use these for a completely different purpose, right? We're going to use these coach referrals, these 3 to 5 that we get, to specifically target schools that we are very interested in. You hold those cards in your back pocket and you don't play them until you have a school that you are super interested in. And I'll give you a little pro tip here, which is the longer that you wait for the ask, the more it's going to help you in the future. If you use that card right away to try to get on a coach's radar, it might be challenging to do that. You might not get the most out of that ask with your travel coach. But if you wait until the end of the process, maybe you've already communicated with that school and now they're sort of stalling a little bit, right? And you're not quite at that offer stage, you're like, man, I really wish we had an insight into what's going on. Then you can ask your coach to call them, and that's going to be so much more worth your time in doing. And so I recommend holding on to these referrals for as long as you possibly can. That's going to make them more powerful. And then, of course, we have recruiting events, which can be interest generators. Like we said, these can bring you 1 to 5 schools. Right? They can. And they might even be way more than that if you're a really, really, really good player or your kid is a really good player, right? And so now we have all 4 of these ways that we are generating interest in the recruiting process helping us, right? I talk to a lot of families who say, hey, we're not getting hardly any interest. And I say, great. Well, can you tell me what you're doing here? And they'll say, well, we're emailing coaches, but we've only emailed, let me grab a different pen. They'll say, we've only emailed about 20. Okay, well, it's just not going to be enough. They'll say, hey, I'm not on Twitter. They'll say, hey, I'm using coach referrals primarily as my interest generation, which we already said, you're not going to get mass exposure from that. So that's also not going to do it for you. And then these recruiting events, right? They're like, hey, I'm going to a bunch of events. It's so hard to generate interest at these events when there are hundreds of kids there. Coaches have no idea who you are. And so the idea is, can we generate interest first? And then when you go to a recruiting event, they actually know who your kid is, so they're looking out for them. So when there are 100 kids in attendance, they're actually only watching like 5 of them, and hopefully your kid is one of those 5. That's going to actually make them worth your time and money. Okay, so we have interest generation. We just talked about these 4 ways, and that is how you're going to get on college coaches' radars. Now, more specifically, okay, when we talk about recruiting events, we're going to work from the right to the left. When we talk about recruiting events, there's 3 ways that this sort of happens. You can either talk to them in person, right? You come up to them in the showcase, you're talking to them, and they're like, hey, this was awesome. That's great. And then the second thing that's going to happen here is they might say, hey, let's stay in touch. Like, I want to stay in touch with you. Keep sending me video and all that good stuff, right? And so that's when you're going to push them into follow-ups. And we're going to talk about follow-ups and sort of what that process looks like here in a little bit. So you're going to push them into follow-ups. And then the other thing they might say is, can you send me more info, right? And so when they say more info, it means that they want some context on you, right? And so this is where we're going to send them to video or even a profile of some sort. When I say profile, I don't mean that it has to be some like NCSA profile with all, your academic stuff, like literally everything. It doesn't even need to be something like that. This honestly should just be a Twitter account. Like, you could just use a Twitter account for your profile, and that is more than enough. It'll be totally fine, right? And so when we talk about showcases and events, these are the first 3 things that are really going to come out of it when we talk about exposure. Now, when you have coach referrals, they're going to send them to really 2 places again. It's going to be that video and it's going to be that profile. Again, that profile can be on Twitter, right? That's where we're pushing them. Now, specifically with Twitter, when you're going to use it as an interest generation tool, there are 4 primary things that have to be in place besides just tweets, right? So the first thing is your bio. Your bio is critical because this is going to be the first interaction that a college coach has with you, or your kid. When they get on your kid's profile, they're going to look at the bio. And so the bio has to be optimized to give the coach the information that they need right away. The second thing is going to be the pinned tweet. We need to use the pinned tweet to hook college coaches in and get them to want to see more so that they see the pinned tweet and they go, oh, I should spend more time recruiting this kid, right? So our pinned tweet has to be optimized. Use DMs to outreach and contact college coaches, a lot like email, right? DMs are basically another form of email, just on another platform. Some sports use Twitter more than others, so it might be easier, depending on your sport, to get responses to DMs than to emails. It just depends. That's why you want to do both. And then finally, you have tags. When you post on Twitter, if you don't have a whole bunch of followers, which your kid probably doesn't, and that's okay, if you just post into the universe, it's going out into the black hole. No one's going to see it, right? It's as if you didn't post at all. So we have to use tags to get specific college coaches to watch specific videos and see specific tweets, right? And so all four of these things really comprise Twitter. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is take them from Twitter and push them to our video. Now, there's going to be videos on Twitter, probably, there should be, of your kid doing their thing. But ultimately, we want to have another hub where there is a whole bunch of video and it's really easy for coaches to navigate through that video. And that's going to be primarily on YouTube, okay? YouTube is the best way and the best host for video. So you're going to take all of this interest that you're hoping to generate on Twitter and you're going to push them to YouTube. And that starts really the next part of the process, which is we're going to take this email and we're going to push them to Twitter. Sorry, that's my phone. Let me turn that off real quick. Okay, so we're taking email and we're pushing it to video. We're taking Twitter and we're pushing it to video. And so this is going to be the first thing that college coaches are going to see of your kid. It is probably the most important part of the recruiting process is video, besides talent. Obviously, you have to have talent. But besides talent, video, because video is the evidence that your kid does have talent. So we're going to take email, we're going to push it to video, we're going to take Twitter, and we're going to push it to video. And when it comes to video, we need to showcase every skill that your kid needs to show for their position, right? So whatever position your kid plays, there's probably a list of skills that they need to showcase that they can do. You need to have video for every single one of those skills. The reason why is because I want you to think about a ship on the water. Forgive my drawing, right? And if that ship has a bunch of holes in it, the ship is going to sink. In the same way, each one of these skills is a hole in your recruiting ship, right? And if you are not able to show evidence that your kid can perform those skills, your recruiting ship will sink, and that is a problem. And so instead of just taking your best clips, which is what everyone does, everyone puts together a 5-minute highlight video and just sends it off to college coaches. Listen, there's no thought or intentionality behind that, and college coaches are going to watch 15 seconds of it, and then they're probably going to click off and forget about your kid. We need to be much more intentional and strategic about how we're actually generating interest from these college coaches. So you're going to take all of that video and you're going to have skills for every single one of or videos of every single one of these skills that your kid needs to showcase. And the goal is we're going to take that email, we're going to point them to video. They're going to watch the video and hopefully they think, hey, this player is really, really good. And they're going to respond and we start the first conversation. The first email is just about starting a conversation. It is not about giving a college coach every piece of information about your kid that they need, right? And this is where a lot of parents commit what I call information overload. In the first email to college coaches, they give so much information to the coach that the coach gets completely overwhelmed. They give them a recruiting profile, they give them video and transcripts and test scores and self-evaluations and coach contact information. And there's so much information that a college coach gets completely overwhelmed. And they're like, I can't deal with this right now. And then they move on to the next kid. All we're trying to do is get them to watch the video. All of those other things will come out in the future. We're about to talk about those things. They're going to come out in the future, but they don't belong in the first email. And so all we're trying to do is open the door for a conversation. And in the subsequent conversations after that, then the rest of the information will come out. And so then let's say that we're able to generate some interest. Let's say that we get something small, okay? Let's say we get like 3 interested schools. This is awesome. The problem is that this is not a scholarship, right? We still have to move from the 3 interested schools that we have and turn them into scholarship opportunities or roster spots. And so we now have to build this interest over time. So we talked about how this piece of the process here in the beginning, these are our interest generators. Beautiful. We've now generated 3 interested schools, which means we are into phase number 2, which is down here. And these are our interest builders. We need to take the interest, these 3 schools, and we need to grow a coach's confidence over time, because they're not going to be ready to give them a scholarship right away. They're going to say, okay, this is a kid worth watching. Let's see if they can continue to perform and they're actually the player we're looking for. So then we have to build that interest over time. So this is the next phase of the process. Let me pull out my eraser so that I can get rid of some of this stuff. All right, so now we're into the interest building phase. All right, so when a coach responds in this first conversation and they say, hey, we're interested, we watched your video, it looks great. There's a couple different ways that they're gonna take this, okay? The first thing that they might say is they'll respond and they'll say, can you send me your transcripts? Because they wanna know if you can get into the school academically. If your kid can't get in, there's no reason for them to continue recruiting them. So they're gonna say, can you send me your transcripts, right? These would be like unofficials, right? Then you have test scores. Maybe the kid's taking SAT, ACT, something like that. And then they're gonna say, can you send me those test scores? Beautiful. They might ask for new or more video. Awesome. If you have it, hopefully you can send more or new video. They might ask for your schedule. They might say, hey, we wanna come watch you play. Can you send me your schedule to see if I'm coming to any of those showcases or tournaments? Or they might say, hey, you know what would be easiest for us is if you came to our camp. Here's what you have to understand about camp invites is that, sure, most of them are generic and they're money grabs and they're basically a fundraiser for the school. But you also got to understand that some of those camp invites really are legitimate, because it is hard for a college coach to go to all of these recruiting events. They're not going to be able to go to all of them. So it is more convenient for them if you go to their camp. So they invite players that they are legitimately interested in recruiting to their camps sometimes. That happens. Just because you got a camp invite doesn't mean that it's not genuine or real. But it also doesn't mean that it is real. It could be fake, right? So I just want to make that distinction that it's entirely possible that you get a camp invite and they really are legitimately interested. But they're going to say, hey, can you send me your schedule, right? Maybe they want to see your schedule so they can come watch you play. They also might say, can you give me a coach contact? Because I want to contact your coach and sort of get a recommendation, a referral, some more information on you. And then the last thing they might say is, hey, let's keep in touch. Right? Let's keep in touch. Keep sending me more information. Keep sending me video. I want to stay engaged with you. And so this now begins, once we go from this first conversation to any of these, right? We now begin what are called follow-ups, right? We have to continue the conversation with coaches, because if you do not convert these conversations to follow-up conversations, the relationships they're going good and then they'll flatline, right? And you will lose that interest and you will have to start all over again, and you're going to go backwards to square one, and you're going to have to generate interest again. So what we're looking to do here is continue to stay top of mind with college coaches and build your value over time. If at this first conversation, when you send the video, a college coach thinks that your kid is let's say a 7 out of 10, right? Hey, pretty good player, but nothing really to write home about. So then over these follow-up conversations, we need to go from a 7 out of 10 to a 7.5. Right? And then we need to go to something like, oh, now we're an 8. And then we're an 8.3, right? And eventually we get to the point where you've built up your value so much that you head into the last stage, which is what we call interest converters. We'll talk about that in a second, okay? Which is essentially converting the interest that you have into real offers. So we need to build your value over time. And essentially, these follow-up conversations are going to go back to all of these things that we talked about before. So remember when I said, Hey, in that first conversation, you're just trying to get them to watch the video. All the other information, the great things about your kid, those will come together or come out in subsequent conversations. These are those subsequent conversations, right? And so you're going to have follow-up conversations where you point them to your transcripts. You're going to have them where you point them to test scores, where you send them new video, you send them your schedule, you give them your coach contact, right? You're going to have all of these things are going to be part of those follow-up conversations. And so just like you would date someone to marry them, you don't, some people, sure, they go on one date and then they get married, but it's pretty rare. Most people go on multiple dates, and the information that comes out about you and about your partner come out over multiple dates until eventually you're like, you know what? This just makes sense. And then you get married. Recruiting is the same thing. And so we use these follow-up conversations to build your kids' value over time. And that is the second part of the process. And now, once we have gotten to a certain threshold, meaning a college coach reaches a confidence threshold. Let's come over here. I'm going to walk through confidence threshold real quick so you understand what I'm talking about. When a college coach, we have confidence, okay? Confidence, this is 0% confident, and this is 100% confident that your kid is the perfect player for their team and they're ready to give them a scholarship. 0% is they've never seen your kid play before, or they don't think they're good enough, right? And so what happens is when you go to generate this first conversation, if they respond positively to this, they might be, I don't know, let's say 40% confident that your kid is a good player, right? They're like, okay, yeah, I'm like a little bit confident. And so over time, with these follow-ups, as we give them more video and test scores and transcripts and the schedule, and they come see us in person, and right, their confidence grows. And so eventually it might go to 60, right? And then eventually it's going to hit like an 80 if they're really serious about you, right? When you hit this 80% threshold, that's when you're going to get to these interest converters. Now, it depends. Some coaches will hop on a phone call pretty early and you might still be at like a, 50 or a 60%. But the converters at the 80%, most of the time, they're fairly certain that your kid is good enough. And they're trying to figure out, do we have enough scholarship spots? Do we have enough money? Is this a good culture fit? Can we get them in academically, right? And so you have these things that are going to really push them over at the top. These are your interest converters. Right? And so in order to get a scholarship, we have to get to the 100% confident mark. The real bummer about this, to be honest with you, is that you could be at like 98% confidence, right? And you still don't have a scholarship because you're not at 100% yet. You're 2% away, but you don't know because a college coach isn't going to like tell you, hey, you're 90% of the way. They're not going to tell you that. And so it might feel like you're at like 50%, and then all of a sudden a school comes through and they're like, hey, yeah, we definitely want you. Here's a scholarship. And you're like, I was not expecting that. And so that's the bummer about it, is you don't really know what confidence level you're at with a school. And that's why it's so critical that you focus on inputs rather than outputs. You focus on the things that you're doing that are going to put you in the best possible position to succeed. And in doing that, you're naturally growing your confidence over time. And you're doing this with enough schools that you're giving yourself a really good chance of success. And then eventually it will naturally, once you hit that 80% threshold, it'll naturally overflow into these interest converters. And notice, this is where the recruiting events become critical. Everyone loves to do recruiting events here in the beginning for exposure. But the reason that a lot of parents use recruiting events for their primary method of exposure is because they don't know how to generate interest with email. They don't know how to generate interest with Twitter. They're relying on their coach to connect them with schools, but they're only getting 3 to 5 schools from them, so they're not generating mass exposure, and they don't know what else to do, so they focus on recruiting events. That's why, but this isn't really the primary purpose of recruiting events. The primary purpose is evaluation. College coaches are watching players that they've already seen before, that they've already talked to, and they're evaluating to see, am I going to get to the 100% threshold mark? 100% confidence where I'm like, this is the player for my team. And so notice, we're going to use recruiting events as an interest converter, not an interest generator. And once you reach this point, and coaches are confident that you are the perfect player for their team, that's when you get scholarships. that's when you get scholarships. And so much of the recruiting process is doing the right thing at the right time, right? It's doing the right thing at the right time. A lot of people are not focused on interest generation in the beginning. They're essentially using evaluation, right? Evaluation tactics like recruiting events for exposure, which is not really what they're for. And so the general idea, if I had to sum up essentially what we just talked about with recruiting, the general idea is that you are trying to generate as much momentum going down this way as you possibly can. And once you get it moving down, you then need to convert that interest into real opportunities. And make no mistake, this right here, where you generate conversations, right? In this example, I think we said we had 3 interested schools. This is the most dangerous place to be in college recruiting because you feel like you are making progress, you've generated interest, but you don't have any scholarships. And so a lot of times parents will say at this point, yeah, we really know how to generate interest. We know what we're doing in college recruiting. We're just not 100% of the way there. This is a dangerous place to be because before you know it, those 3 schools, the relationships with them will fizzle, they'll flatline, and you're going to go back to square one real fast, and you will have lost a bunch of time that you could have been generating interest in offers. And so there are less spots later in the process than earlier in the process. And so this is the most dangerous place to be in college recruiting by far. And so we have to be able to take that interest and turn it into offers, which is very, very difficult to do. It's a really hard process. That's, in fact, the hardest part. It's not generating interest in the first place. It's actually converting interest on the back end. And so we just focus on inputs and doing the right things. And with enough talent and enough evidence and enough exposure and enough of the right inputs, you can get a good amount of interest in offers so that your kid at the end of the process has options. They get to choose where they want to go to school. They're not forced to accept one offer because it's the only one that they got. We're trying to generate as many options as we can by the end of the process so you and your family get to pick just the best fit school for your kid and they have an awesome experience. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of what the recruiting process looks like from A to Z. I will include some resources down below in the description, and I will see you guys next time.